The night settled over the village like a soft, dark blanket, muffling the sounds of the day. The full moon hung low, casting a silver glow across the clay rooftops and winding dirt paths. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of sand and herbs from nearby gardens, brushing through the open windows of small homes. Within one of these modest dwellings, Amara lay asleep, her breathing even and calm, unaware of the danger creeping closer in the shadow of jealousy. Her bed, a simple wooden frame with a thin mattress and woven blankets, had always been her refuge. It held the warmth of her dreams, the quiet solace of a home where she had learned to survive under the watchful eyes of a cruel stepmother. The night was peaceful, filled only with the soft chorus of crickets and the occasional rustle of a distant animal moving through the desert grass. But beneath the soft moonlight in the room across the hall, her stepmother watched. Her eyes glinted with a mixture of envy and rage, fixed on the sleeping girl. Every sound Amara made, the slight shift of her pillow, the whisper of her breath, seemed to inflame the stepmother's anger. She had long harbored a desire to claim what was not hers, to assert control over a girl whose gentle nature drew admiration and sympathy from the village. Tonight she would act. Carefully she gathered a bundle of dry twigs and scraps of cloth, the kind that burned quickly and produced an eager flame. The quiet house seemed to hold its breath as she moved closer to Amara's room. Her steps were silent, but the air around her seemed heavy, thick with the tension of her intentions. She struck a single match and the flame flickered to life, dancing hungrily in her fingers. With trembling satisfaction, she placed the tinder near the edge of Amara's bed, hidden from sight until the moment it ignited. The first flicker of fire caught in the corner of the blanket, a small tongue of orange heat that hissed softly as it met the fabric. Amara stirred, a faint groan slipping from her lips. She opened her eyes to find a glow that did not belong, and her heart leapt. The blankets were curling, blackening at the edges. Smoke began to fill the room, curling in thin, twisting streams toward the ceiling. The acrid smell of burning cloth stung her nostrils, and panic rose sharply in her chest. She leapt from the bed, her bare feet hitting the wooden floor with a thud. The heat from the growing fire licked her skin, and the sound of crackling wood filled the room, sharp and insistent. Each snap and pop of the flames seemed almost alive, a warning that this was no ordinary fire. Her mind raced, thinking of escape, of doors and windows, of the chaos that would soon erupt beyond the walls. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. A neighbor walking his goat noticed a faint glow through the small gaps in the houses. He paused, squinting toward the light, and then ran, shouting to alert others. Soon, a chorus of alarmed voices filled the narrow streets, blending with the distant howl of wind across the desert plains. Villagers rushed from their homes, carrying buckets of water, blankets, anything that might help save what could be saved. Inside Amara's room, the fire grew bolder, climbing up the sides of the bed and licking at the low ceiling beams. She grabbed a nearby bucket of water, splashing it toward the flames, but the fire seemed to twist around the liquid, evading it as though it had a mind of its own. Each attempt to douse it was met with resistance, and the heat pressed closer, a tangible force that seemed almost sentient. Fear and awe mixed in Amara's chest. The fire did not consume indiscriminately, it moved with intent, shifting its path, curling around objects rather than simply burning them. She realized with a shiver that ran down her spine, that the flames were no ordinary flames. They were aware, responsive, a force awakened by her stepmother's malice. As the first villagers arrived, pounding on doors and shouting warnings, the stepmother watched from a safe distance, thinking her plan was succeeding. But the fire's behavior unsettled her. It leapt toward her with a flicker of movement that seemed almost playful, a teasing menace that sent a jolt of fear through her heart. She took a cautious step back, her mind racing with disbelief. Amara, seizing a moment of clarity, darted toward the window, her hair catching the moonlight as she moved. She leapt down to the ground outside, feeling the sand beneath her feet as the fire roared behind her. The villagers followed, forming a line to help contain the blaze, but they too sensed something extraordinary. The fire seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, attacking no innocent soul, targeting only the shadow of betrayal. By the time the sun began to rise, the first hints of dawn brushing the horizon with soft pink and gold, the fire had done more than burn a bed. It had marked the night with a tale of fear, revenge, and a force beyond human control. Amara stood among the villagers, breathing heavily, her eyes wide but unwavering. And somewhere deep within the flames, a promise lingered. The fire would not forget, and neither would it forgive. The first hints of the stepmother's jealousy were subtle, almost imperceptible, like shadows stretching across a sunlit room. At first, she would sigh heavily whenever Amara walked past, brushing a hand over her faded dress as if the girl's calm presence reminded her of all that she had lost. She watched the villagers speak with Amara in the market, their voices soft, respectful, and tinged with admiration, and felt a cold knot of envy coil tighter in her chest. The way the merchants lingered, asking for advice or guidance, the way mothers entrusted her with children for minor ailments, all of it stoked her bitterness. Her envy began to manifest in small, deliberate acts of malice. One morning, Amara found a cracked bowl in her kitchen cupboard, its edge shattered as if it had been dropped. She suspected her stepmother, who had a habit of appearing just after minor accidents, offering half-hearted apologies and knowing glances that seemed to say, "See? Carelessness follows you everywhere." Another time, a carefully stored bundle of herbs, meant for a sick villager, went missing. Amara searched the home, heart sinking as she found them hidden behind a floorboard, dry and wilted from neglect. Her stepmother had smiled when she discovered the damage, pretending to be concerned while silently relishing the disruption of Amara's gentle order. Whispers became another weapon. The stepmother would murmur sly comments in passing to neighbors or cousins. "Do you think she's truly as harmless as she seems?" Or, "Sometimes I wonder where her luck comes from. It is not the sort of fortune ordinary people hold." These remarks, half questions and half accusations, planted seeds of doubt among the villagers. Children would pause when passing Amara's home, wary of the quiet girl whose hands healed and whose words soothed, because somewhere in their minds was the faint echo of the stepmother's insinuations. Even more direct sabotage emerged in small, nearly imperceptible ways. A pot of stew would be left to cool too long and spoil, a bundle of fresh herbs would be mixed with dust, a freshly mended garment might have its threads loosened overnight. Each act was minor in isolation, but the cumulative effect was to unsettle Amara, to make her question her own careful attention and skill. Her stepmother seemed to delight in these tiny victories, smiling faintly whenever Amara expressed mild frustration, as if confirming some unspoken inferiority. Beyond these minor cruelties, the stepmother's jealousy extended to Amara's beauty and composure. Villagers often spoke of the way Amara's hair shimmered under the sun, the way her eyes seemed to reflect even the smallest joy or sorrow, and the soft grace with which she moved through the market or tended her siblings. The stepmother, whose youth and charm had long faded under the weight of her own bitterness, felt the contrast sharply. Every compliment Amara received, every respectful nod from a neighbor, fanned the flames of her envy. She began to view her stepdaughter's very existence as a threat, a living reminder of all the admiration and warmth she herself no longer commanded. Even her stepmother's closest confidants noted the growing tension. She spoke more sharply, her eyes narrowing when Amara was praised. She lingered in corners during village gatherings, her lips pressing into a thin line as she watched Amara assist an elder, carry a basket of herbs or guide a lost child home. Every act of kindness, every smile, every quiet demonstration of skill became another mark against her. In the days leading up to the fire, the stepmother's schemes intensified. She would hide herbs or mix them incorrectly, subtly sabotaging Amara's remedies. She broke a favorite cup in a loud, dramatic manner, feigning accident while making sure the shards remained where Amara would find them. She whispered threats beneath her breath, meant only for Amara's ears. Enjoy your safety while you can. No one protects you forever. The villagers, for their part, were caught between admiration and suspicion. Some began to glance at Amara more warily, recalling rumors that her skill might not be entirely natural, that she might be touched by forces unseen. Others continued to trust her, seeking her advice and following her guidance, unaware that the stepmother's jealousy was steadily brewing into a storm that would soon erupt in fire. Every day the weight of these small acts of malice pressed on Amara. She remained patient, graceful, and composed, tending to her siblings and her work as if the world's envy could not touch her. But the tension was rising, each broken object, each whispered threat, each stolen herb a spark in the tinder of the stepmother's wrath. And somewhere in the silent corners of her home, the stepmother's heart was quietly plotting the culmination of her jealousy, a single act of fire that would transform envy into action and set the night alight. The night had swallowed the village in a heavy darkness, broken only by the flickering lanterns of a few late wanderers returning home. Inside the small house, Amara's bed sat like a silent sanctuary, its blankets folded neatly, her hair spread across the pillow in waves that caught the faint glow of the moon. The stepmother and her conspirators approached cautiously, flint and tinder in hand, their breaths shallow and hurried. Their hearts beat with anticipation, the thrill of impending cruelty mingling with a creeping sense of unease they could not yet name. With a quiet hiss, the first spark touched the edge of the blanket. Instantly, the fire began its work, but not as the stepmother had imagined. Instead of consuming Amara's bed with mindless hunger, the flames moved as if alive, curling and twisting in patterns that defied the laws of the ordinary. They seemed to sense the girl's innocence, recoiling from her presence while creeping toward those who had intended harm. Each leap of the fire was deliberate, almost conscious, as though it could distinguish between guilt and purity. Amara awoke to the warmth that pressed against her skin, a stark, dangerous heat that made her eyes snap open. She gasped, taking in the sight before her. The flames danced and twisted, forming shapes in the air that resembled faces contorted with anger and sorrow, like echoes of those who had suffered before. The fire did not roar mindlessly, it pulsed, ebbing and flowing with a rhythm that mirrored her own quickening heartbeat. Smoke curled into the room, carrying with it a scent both acrid and strangely sweet, like incense burning in a temple of unseen powers. The stepmother watched, initially in disbelief, her eyes narrowing in confusion. She had expected shrieking panic, a helpless girl engulfed in flames, yet Amara remained untouched, her body safe, her hair untouched by the licking fire. Instead, the flames arched and curled toward the stepmother and her accomplices, their tongues of light reaching out like living fingers. Each step the guilty women took seemed to draw the fire closer, as if it had memorized every act of jealousy and malice they had committed over the years. The conspirators stumbled backward, shouting in panic. One waved a hand toward the fire, attempting to push it away, but the flames shifted instantly, forming swirling arcs that danced around their wrists rather than receding. Their fear was palpable, each breath shallow and ragged, as the heat intensified in their immediate vicinity. The fire seemed to recognize the intention behind their movements, the desire to harm, the lust for power, and responded accordingly. It wrapped around their ankles like binding cords, leaving Amara free and unharmed. Amara's eyes widened as she realized the extraordinary nature of the blaze. Her fear and sorrow, emotions she had tried to suppress for years under the stepmother's cruelty, seemed to feed the fire in a way that neither she nor the conspirators could comprehend. The flames pulsed with a strange sentience, curling higher with each spike of her pulse, creating intricate patterns in the air, like threads weaving a tapestry of justice. Shadows on the walls appeared alive, elongated and twisting into forms that mirrored the guilty's own intentions and the pain they had caused. The stepmother's lips trembled as she muttered curses and commands, each word ignored by the dancing fire. It climbed higher, flickering with an almost predatory intelligence, seeking those who had plotted against Amara. Her accomplices cried out, trying to flee, but the fire anticipated their movements, shifting to block paths, to steer them back toward the center of their guilt. Each step they took brought a wave of heat and light closer, forcing them to stumble over scattered belongings, over the floorboards, until they realized with horror that their plan had entirely backfired. Amara's fear had been her only companion until now, but as she watched, a strange calm settled over her. The flames, in their almost conscious dance, responded not with indiscriminate destruction but with precision. They arched like protective wings around her body, illuminating her face with a golden glow that seemed to reflect the purity of her spirit. She remained seated on the edge of her bed, breathing deeply, the fire's energy moving around her like a living shield. The stepmother screamed as a tongue of flame shot toward her, curling and coiling, licking the air around her with intent that terrified her. Each attempt to dodge was met with a graceful, almost knowing movement of the blaze. The conspirators shrank back, their confidence evaporating in the face of this extraordinary force. They had thought to control the night, to harm a girl they deemed weaker, yet now the very flames they had set were her allies. Smoke rose thick and heavy, curling into shapes that seemed to mimic the faces of those who had been wronged in the past, adding a chorus of silent accusation to the scene. The fire's light danced across the walls, highlighting the stepmother's terror and the conspirators' panic. Amara's heart pounded not from fear alone, but from awe at the sentience in the flames, their strange beauty and their unwavering defense. By the time the villagers gathered outside, drawn by the scent of smoke and the flickering glow visible through the windows, the fire had fully revealed its intent. Amara remained untouched, her presence calm and resolute, while the flames had begun to shift and sweep toward those who had wronged her, a living force of retribution that no human planning could have anticipated. The night, once quiet and moonlit, now throbbed with a power that was part grief, part justice, and wholly alive, ensuring that the stepmother's cruelty would be met by the fire's own formidable will. Amara's pulse raced as the flames licked hungrily at the edges of her room, twisting and surging with a life that was both terrifying and strangely protective. She knew that hesitation could cost her everything. Years of observing the village, memorizing every alley, every hidden path through the trees, now became a lifeline. She rose from the edge of her bed, careful not to disturb the fire's delicate, almost conscious dance around her, and moved silently toward the small back door that opened to the narrow alley behind the house. The stepmother's shouts rang out, harsh and frantic, calling for the conspirators to stop her. But Amara did not falter. Her mind was sharp and precise, recalling each twist and turn of the village paths she had explored as a child, each brush of the forest's edge where she could slip unnoticed. She pressed close to the walls, her hands grazing the rough clay, feeling for cracks and ledges that marked the safest route. Her breath came in shallow, controlled gasps, mingling with the scent of smoke and scorched straw that hung heavy in the air. Once she reached the alley, Amara kept low, her skirts brushing the ground as she darted between stacked clay jars and barrels of grain. The conspirators were still struggling to contain their panic, their attention drawn to the fire that seemed to move of its own accord. Their yells and the crackle of burning would create a chaotic symphony, but she did not let it break her rhythm. Each step was measured, guided by memory and intuition. She turned corners sharply, using the maze-like arrangement of homes and walls to obscure her passage, while the fire behind her leapt toward those who sought her harm rather than pursuing her own retreating form. The villagers, awakened by the commotion, emerged cautiously into the streets. Some froze at the sight of the flames dancing with unnatural patterns, unsure whether to rush in or flee. Others craned their necks to see the young girl slipping through the shadows, her figure small but determined, guided by knowledge no one else possessed. A few brave souls whispered encouragement from behind protective doors, recognizing that Amara's calm and skillful movements belied the chaos surrounding her. She reached the edge of the forest, where twisted trees and dense undergrowth provided cover. Here, her knowledge of natural hideaways became essential. She ducked beneath low branches, pushed aside brambles, and used the terrain to mask her movements from those pursuing her. The smell of wet earth and moss filled her senses, grounding her in the familiar, even as her heart pounded from the exertion and fear. She paused only briefly to catch her breath, listening to the distant crackling of fire and the faint, panicked shouts of the stepmother and her accomplices. The forest, alive with nocturnal sounds, seemed to embrace her, shielding her from prying eyes and offering a temporary sanctuary. Every instinct sharpened as she moved deeper into the trees. She knew which paths led to hidden clearings, where a well-placed rock or fallen log could provide a barrier, and which shadows could conceal her from the worst of the chaos. Her awareness extended to the smallest details, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, the distant call of an owl, all guiding her safely along the winding forest floor. Fear was present, yes, but it was tempered by knowledge and experience, by the quiet understanding that she was not merely fleeing, but outsmarting those who meant her harm. As dawn approached, the first pale light of morning filtering through the canopy, Amara found a secluded spot on the far side of the forest. Here, she paused, listening to the wind carrying the distant cries and the fading roar of the village fire. She allowed herself a moment to draw a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs and steady her racing heart. Relief was tempered with vigilance. She knew the stepmother's anger would not dissipate quickly, nor would the villagers' whispers vanish overnight. Yet for now she was safe, her body unharmed and her spirit intact, sheltered by the very knowledge that had been her constant companion. Back in the village, those who had witnessed her escape spoke in hushed tones, telling stories of a girl who moved like a shadow and a fire that obeyed no human hand. Eyes turned toward the forest edge, scanning for any sign of her, but none were found. Amara had disappeared, leaving behind only the smoke and ash, a trail of awe and fear that would linger in the minds of the villagers long after the flames had subsided. In her heart, she felt the first stirrings of quiet power, the understanding that the forest, the land, and even the flames themselves could be allies when guided by courage, intelligence, and an unwavering will to survive. The morning after Imani's mysterious burns, the village awoke to a new atmosphere, one heavy with unease and unspoken fear. The sun rose over clay roofs and dusty streets, but the warmth of the light did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the hearts of the villagers. Conversations were hushed, movements tentative, and eyes darted constantly to doorways and windows, as if the shadows themselves might carry the judgment of the flames. Rumors had already begun to spread, moving faster than the morning breeze. Traders, who arrived from nearby settlements, whispered of a fire that obeyed no human command, a blaze that could distinguish between guilt and innocence. Mothers tugged children close, recounting the story of Imani's suffering in hushed tones, while fathers frowned and glanced at their neighbors, uncertain who might be next. The tales were embroidered with every telling. Some said the flames had danced like living serpents, others claimed they had formed shapes that reflected the conscience of the guilty. The villagers, once skeptical, now spoke in reverent fear, convinced that Amara's survival and the fire's vengeance were intertwined. Even routine tasks were approached with caution. Merchants hesitated to visit the stepmother's home, leaving goods unsold and paths untraveled. Children avoided areas near the burned house, their footsteps light and hurried as they moved past the blackened remains. Elderly women muttered prayers beneath their breath, throwing grains of salt or scattering water over thresholds in hopes of protection from a power they did not understand. The presence of the flames, though no longer visible in their destructive form, lingered in the minds and hearts of every villager. The stepmother herself became a figure of whispered dread. No longer commanding authority through fear or cunning, she moved through the village with furtive steps, her head lowered, eyes darting toward shadows as if expecting fire to erupt at any moment. Her allies fared no better. The conspirators, once emboldened by shared schemes, now found themselves shunned, avoided, and watched with suspicion. Villagers crossed the street to avoid walking near them, and even casual greetings were met with silence or nervous nods. Each step they took seemed heavy with anticipation, as though the weight of their misdeeds was physically dragging them down. In marketplaces and public spaces, people gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the flames and Amara's power. Some argued over whether it was a curse, a miracle, or divine intervention. Others remained silent, eyes wide, unwilling to voice doubts for fear of drawing attention to themselves. Merchants rearranged their stalls to avoid the burned house's vicinity, while travelers passing through the village paused at a distance, sensing the tension in the air and noting the wary glances of locals. Even the natural world seemed to respond. Dogs refused to approach certain streets, crows circled above with strange persistence, and the wind carried an eerie stillness through alleys where children no longer played. Fear became a social contagion. Families whispered about which homes might be next, wondering if proximity to the conspirators could bring misfortune. Friends turned cautiously away from one another, and gossip shifted from mundane concerns to speculation over unseen forces. The village's communal life, once vibrant and interconnected, became fractured by hesitation and suspicion. People avoided eye contact with the stepmother and her allies, hesitant to draw their gaze toward those marked by the flame's judgment. The fear was tangible, a weight pressing on shoulders, whispering that misfortune could strike at any moment. Meanwhile, the stepmother's arrogance, once her shield, had been replaced by paranoia. She and her companions no longer walked freely through the streets. Instead, they moved in short, measured bursts, constantly checking behind them, scanning rooftops and alleys for signs of the fire's presence. Sleep eluded them, their dreams haunted by flickering flames, the sound of crackling wood, and the faint, accusing laughter of the girl they had sought to harm. Their confidence had been replaced by dread, a creeping realization that their carefully plotted malice had unleashed a force far beyond their control. Villagers began to interpret every unusual occurrence as a sign of the fire's reach. A sudden gust of wind that rustled rooftops, the flicker of shadows against clay walls, or even the unexpected twitch of an animal could be read as evidence that the flames, or Amara's unseen influence, were watching. Superstitions long held in the village, once relegated to tales for children, now became serious warnings. Elders reminded younger villagers of the old stories of protective spirits and justice meted out to those who acted with malice, framing the night's events as a tangible example of moral retribution. Even those not directly involved in the conspiracy felt the weight of fear. The idea that cruelty, envy, or malice could summon consequences beyond human comprehension spread like wildfire. Parents warned children not to mock, cheat, or steal, citing Amara's ordeal as proof that even small acts of wrongdoing could awaken forces beyond their control. The village became a place of heightened awareness, where every glance and gesture was measured, every step carefully considered. In the shadow of the burned house, the stepmother's plot had transformed into a lesson for all. The village had witnessed a power that was selective, precise, and merciless toward those who harbored ill intent. Conversations carried an undertone of respect and caution whenever Amara's name was mentioned. People avoided direct confrontation with the stepmother and her allies, not out of sympathy but out of fear. The once mundane streets were now charged with a silent, watchful tension, the kind that lingers long after a visible threat has passed. By the end of the week, It was clear that the fire's justice had reshaped the social fabric of the village. Villagers no longer dismissed Amara's skill or presence. Instead, they whispered her name with reverence, acknowledging a power that had protected her and punished her enemies. Fear had spread not just as a reaction to the immediate events but as a collective understanding. Cruelty toward the innocent, when combined with envy and malice, could invoke forces beyond human control. And in this new reality, the stepmother and her allies were not merely shunned. They were symbols of what happens when jealousy is allowed to fester unchecked. A cautionary tale carried in every wary glance and whispered conversation throughout the village. Amara emerged from the forest just as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and rose. Her clothes, once neat and simple, were smudged with ash and streaked with dew from the undergrowth she had traversed. Her hair clung in damp strands to her face, but her eyes, steady, dark, and unyielding, carried a calm determination that betrayed neither fear nor haste. Every step toward the village was measured, deliberate, as though she were threading a path between the visible and invisible forces that lingered after the night of the fire. The village itself seemed to hold its breath. Doors remained closed, windows shuttered, and those who had dared to peer out moved back quickly, their faces pale with apprehension. Even birds that normally greeted the morning with song perched silently on rooftops and wires, as though sensing the tension in the air. The faint smell of smoke, lingering from the burned bed and the still warm embers of the night before, clung to the streets and alleys, mingling with the earthy scent of dawn dew. It was as if the village itself remembered the flame's selective justice, anticipating the return of the one who had survived them. The stepmother, awakened early by instinct or perhaps the nervous shifting of her allies, was the first to notice Amara. Her eyes widened in panic at the sight of the girl walking unhurriedly toward the burned house. She muttered curses under her breath, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting fire to spring forth and consume her in retaliation. Her previous confidence had been replaced by a subtle, trembling fear, and her allies mirrored her unease. Their earlier bravado evaporated like smoke in the morning air. Amara did not speak. She moved with quiet grace, her steps barely disturbing the ground beneath her. Yet her presence alone carried weight, an unspoken assertion that the events of the previous night were not to be dismissed. Villagers who had dared to peek through cracks in doors or gaps in shutters found themselves transfixed by the sight. The girl who had fled the flames now returned untouched, and yet the memory of the fire seemed to cling to her like a second skin. Even the air around her seemed charged, warm and vibrating, hinting at a power that did not need words to announce itself. As she walked through the village, Amara observed familiar landmarks with careful eyes. The burned bed in her home, now reduced to blackened timbers and ash, served as a stark reminder of what had happened, and of what had survived. She passed quietly, stepping over scattered remnants, allowing no trace of fear to show. Her gaze occasionally met that of villagers who could not help but stare. Some averted their eyes quickly, while others whispered among themselves, recognizing in her the same calm strength that had guided her escape. It was clear to all that she had not returned merely to reclaim a home or possessions, but to assert her presence, to remind the village that she was neither fragile nor powerless. The stepmother attempted to intercept her as she reached the threshold of her home. "You, how dare you?" she stammered, her voice trembling. Her companion stood behind her, awkwardly trying to assert dominance but faltering under the weight of Amara's silent authority. The villagers watched from their hiding places, hearts pounding, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Amara stopped a few steps from the threshold. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, rested on the stepmother and the conspirators, and though she spoke no words, her intent was unmistakable. A subtle shift in the air seemed to accompany her presence. The warmth of the morning breeze carried a faint crackle, almost like the whisper of flames. Even without fire visible, there was a sensation of heat and anticipation, as if the very elements themselves acknowledged her claim to the space and her power to command the consequences of the previous night. The stepmother's bravado faltered entirely. She took a cautious step back, glancing at her companions for reassurance, but found only their wide-eyed panic mirrored in her own fear. For the first time, the villagers saw the conspirators as vulnerable, aware that the injustice they had attempted to commit had unleashed forces beyond their control. Whispers began to circulate among the crowd, tentative at first and then with growing confidence. The girl who had been nearly burned alive had returned unscathed, and the fire had chosen its path carefully, punishing only those who had meant her harm. Amara's gaze swept over the village square, taking in the fearful expressions, the tentative movements, the subtle avoidance by those who had sided with her stepmother. Her presence commanded the space without force, It was the memory of the fire, the lingering aura of justice, and the knowledge that she could summon its power if needed, that kept the conspirators rooted in place. Each small movement of hers, the adjustment of her cloak, the careful placement of her feet, reinforced an invisible dominance, a reminder that she had survived what should have been her end and that the flames were not done teaching lessons. Some villagers stepped cautiously from their hiding places, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and awe. They spoke in hushed tones, observing the stepmother's trembling and the conspirators' hesitant postures. "She walks as if nothing can touch her," one whispered. Another nodded, whispering back, "And yet we feel the heat, even from afar." These murmurs spread quickly, reinforcing the sense that Amara's return was a moment of reckoning not just for the conspirators but for the village itself. A lesson in respect, caution, and the consequences of envy and cruelty. Amara paused at the edge of her home, scanning the faces before her. She remained silent, letting the fear and awe do the work that words could not. Her stepmother swallowed hard, eyes darting to the burned bed, then to the girl who had survived it. It was clear that the balance of power had shifted. No longer would the stepmother's petty jealousies dominate, no longer would conspirators act with impunity. The village, sensing this change, held its collective breath, aware that Amara's return signaled both justice and the continuation of a story that would be remembered for years to come. Even as she moved further into the village square, the subtle heat that seemed to cling to her presence never faded. It was a reminder that the flames had their own will, that her courage and survival had summoned a force beyond ordinary reckoning, and that the stepmother and her allies were now vulnerable in ways they could neither escape nor ignore. The villagers, though still cautious, began to speak of her with a mix of respect, awe, and fear, a recognition that Amara had returned not merely as a girl who had survived, but as the living embodiment of the justice that the flames carried. Amara entered her modest home with deliberate steps, her eyes steady and unflinching. The familiar scent of herbs and old wood greeted her, mingling with the lingering scent of charred fabric and ashes from the night of the fire. She did not rush. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, and full of quiet authority. The villagers, who had begun to gather cautiously outside, could see through the open doorway that this encounter would not be ordinary. It would be a reckoning, a confrontation charged with the invisible power that had spared Amara and punished her stepmother's allies. The stepmother's face went pale the moment Amara crossed the threshold. She had imagined that the girl, despite surviving the fire, would retreat into the safety of the forest or nearby hills, cowed and frightened. But here she was, walking deliberately toward the heart of the home she had tried to destroy. Her companions huddled behind her, muttering nervously to one another, their bravado from the previous day replaced with palpable tension. They did not dare intervene. Even standing too close seemed to invite misfortune. Amara's gaze swept the room, taking in the charred remnants of her bed and the scattered ashes that were once thought harmless. Her presence alone seemed to animate the embers still resting in the hearth, though no flame burned openly. A faint orange glow began to flicker along the edges of the coals, small sparks lifting and hovering in the air as if drawn to her intent. The stepmother froze, sensing the change in the room, the subtle but undeniable movement of fire as if alive, responding to a consciousness beyond human understanding. Amara did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes, steady and unyielding, held the stepmother's attention and held it fast. With a slight motion of her hand, the embers rose higher, circling like miniature fire spirits, their movement deliberate and purposeful. The stepmother's companions gasped in shock, fumbling for words that failed to come. The air in the room thickened, charged with heat that was not suffocating but undeniably menacing. The flames, small though they were, seemed to respond only to the guilty, drawn toward those who had acted with envy and malice. The stepmother's face twisted in terror. She took a step backward, nearly tripping over the scattered remains of charred fabric. It cannot be," she stammered, her voice trembling. "You cannot control fire." Her companions echoed her disbelief, but even as they tried to shout or command her to stop, the embers hovered around her, drawn to her movements, responding to the fear she radiated. Amara extended her hand slightly, not in aggression but in quiet command. The embers darted like living creatures, circling the stepmother's head, tracing her arms, moving with precision that betrayed intelligence. The stepmother's allies shrank back, attempting to pull her away, but the invisible tether of the flames seemed to prevent any escape. The fire had chosen its target, and its will was not to be defied. The stepmother screamed, stumbling back as the embers hovered closer, brushing against her skin, causing heat to prick and sting. It was not a consuming fire, but a warning, an assertion of power that left no doubt. the flames were alive, and their allegiance was to the girl she had tried to harm. Her hands flailed, her voice rising in panic, but Amara remained calm, her eyes fixed on the stepmother, steady as the sun rising outside. Outside the house, villagers peered through cracks in the doors and windows, murmuring in awe. They could see the embers moving unnaturally, responding only to the stepmother and her guilt. Some whispered prayers, others crossed themselves, and children clutched their mother's hands, wide-eyed at the display of what they believed to be the fire's conscious justice. Even those who had doubted Amara's abilities before felt a tremor of respect and fear ripple through them. Amara's calmness contrasted sharply with the stepmother's terror. Each movement of the girl's hand, each slight tilt of her head, directed the ember's motion, guiding the fire as it hovered menacingly around the guilty party. The stepmother's screams intensified as she realized that her cunning plan, her years of envy and malice, had come back to confront her in a form she could not fight or flee from. The flames were not a tool she could manipulate, nor a danger that could be escaped. They were a manifestation of justice itself, responding to moral imbalance with a precision that defied human comprehension. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the stepmother's panic grew, her voice breaking, her movements frantic. She fell to her knees, trying to shield herself from the invisible threat, and her companions scrambled to help, only to be met with the same unyielding heat that seemed drawn to wrongdoing. The fire, subtle yet unmistakable, taught a lesson in humility, courage, and consequence, and the villagers watched silently, understanding that no words could match the power of this display. Amara finally lowered her hand, and the embers slowly descended back to the hearth, leaving the stepmother trembling on the floor, her pride shattered, her fear etched into every line of her face. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the cooled coals and the ragged breaths of the stepmother and her companions. The demonstration had been clear. The flames were not mere fire, but a force aligned with Amara's resilience and moral rightness. The villagers, witnessing from a distance, exchanged glances of awe and disbelief. The tale of the night's events had been more than whispers. They had seen the flames will, understood the power of Amara's calm authority, and recognized the futility of cruelty. The stepmother and her allies had learned in that quiet, charged moment, that no scheme born of envy or malice could withstand the subtle but unrelenting force of justice. Amara stood calmly in the center of the room, her presence commanding yet serene. The fire, once menacing and responsive, now rested quietly in the hearth, its lesson delivered. Outside, the villagers exhaled collectively, the tension in the air slowly dissipating, leaving behind a mixture of relief, reverence, and the quiet acknowledgement that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The stepmother's terror remained, a permanent reminder of the power that had spared the innocent while punishing the guilty, and the story of the flames will begin to take its place in the village's collective memory, whispered from one generation to the next. The morning after Amara's quiet demonstration of the fire's will, the village seemed to hold its breath, aware that the reckoning was far from complete. The stepmother and her allies had retreated to the outer edges of the village, believing that distance might shield them from the subtle, responsive flames. But fire, as the villagers had come to understand, was no ordinary element. It had a mind of its own, a purpose aligned with the balance of justice, and it had not yet finished its task. The first signs appeared as faint orange flickers along the edge of the stepmother's home. At first she thought it was a trick of the morning sun, a reflection glinting off clay walls. Her companions noticed as well, exchanging uneasy glances. But soon the flames began to move with deliberate speed, dancing over rooftops, across the dry grass, and toward the guilty with uncanny precision. The stepmother's bravado evaporated, replaced by a chilling panic that spread to her allies. Amara watched from a safe distance, her eyes steady, her expression calm. She did not need to command the fire. It recognized her, recognized the moral truth of the situation, and moved as though guided by her presence alone. The flames were intelligent, almost sentient, rising and twisting in patterns that mimicked serpents and tendrils, their heat intense but measured, targeting only those who bore ill will. Villagers peered from behind doors and shutters, hearts pounding as the spectacle unfolded. The fire advanced slowly at first, giving the conspirators every opportunity to flee. The stepmother screamed, her voice rising above the crackling of the approaching flames, urging her companions to run. But the fire did not relent. It flowed like a living river, following them with uncanny precision, wrapping around fences, leaping over hedges, and moving with a fluidity that defied the ordinary laws of nature. Even when they tried to cross the stream of a nearby river, The fire seemed to hesitate only momentarily before vaulting across with supernatural grace, keeping its focus firmly on its intended targets. The villagers could scarcely believe what they were seeing. The flames twisted and contorted in midair, forming shapes that mimicked human figures and shadows, as though the fire itself were interrogating the stepmother and her conspirators, understanding their intentions and punishing their deceit. Sparks hovered around their heads, circling like wary birds, then struck with pinpoint accuracy, singeing clothes, scorching skin, but never harming the innocent nearby. It was controlled fury, a surreal dance of justice that blurred the line between reality and something far beyond human comprehension. The stepmother stumbled through the streets, dragging her companions behind her, the fire following relentlessly. Each step they took seemed to provoke the flames, drawing tendrils closer, wrapping around their ankles, brushing against their bodies, leaving them seared but not destroyed outright, yet always reminding them that there was no escape. Her cries turned to wails of terror as the fire responded to the depth of her malice and envy, each flicker of flame attuned to the exact measure of her guilt. Amara's presence remained the stabilizing force behind the spectacle. Standing on a small rise overlooking the village, she did not gesture or speak. The fire knew its charge, needing no further instruction. Its movements were precise, its intention clear. Villagers watched, some falling to their knees in awe, others clutching their children and muttering prayers. No one dared intervene. They could only witness the fire's moral precision as it enacted a justice both terrifying and awe-inspiring. As the stepmother and her companions tried to find refuge in abandoned homes, the flames followed, curling through doorways, slipping under eaves and leaving nothing to chance. The fire did not consume indiscriminately. It was selective, targeting only those whose hearts had nurtured envy, cruelty, and betrayal. Windows and walls glowed with orange light, casting dancing shadows that mimicked the terror of those within, a reflection of their inner malice. The conspirators' attempts to hide were futile. The flames seemed to sense every corner, every crevice, every hesitation born of fear. The surreal quality of the fire became more pronounced as it interacted with the environment. Sparks formed intricate patterns in the air, looping and twisting into shapes that resembled chains, mirrors, and faces contorted in agony, echoes of the conspirators' own sins. It was as if the fire not only pursued but also judged, translating their misdeeds into a visual language that the villagers could witness. The heat prickled the skin of those watching from a distance, a reminder that justice carried weight beyond the ordinary and that Amara's protection of the innocent was not limited to mere survival. Finally, the stepmother and her allies were cornered at the edge of the village, near the old dry riverbed. The flames rose higher, forming a wall that surrounded them completely. Their cries were frantic, voices overlapping in fear and pleading. Yet the fire did not act out of vengeance for its own sake. It acted as a mirror of the malice that had been directed at Amara, reflecting their cruelty back upon them in a controlled, almost ritualistic judgment. The villagers watched silently, understanding that this was the culmination of a moral balance restored, a reckoning they would not soon forget. The stepmother fell to her knees, her companions collapsed beside her, and the fire's tendrils brushed against them, rapping gently but unyieldingly. It burned with intensity yet careful measure, as though marking the boundary between punishment and annihilation, showing the power of justice without descending into mindless destruction. The flames danced higher, then curled around their feet, then up their arms, until each conspirator was enveloped in a living tapestry of fire, a final embrace of reckoning that left no doubt about the consequences of their envy and cruelty. As the last of the fire's tendrils retracted, leaving behind scorched earth and the faint scent of smoke, the stepmother and her allies were nowhere to be seen. The villagers stepped cautiously into the streets, witnessing the aftermath. The area where they had been trapped was cleared of life, yet no indiscriminate damage had been done. The justice was precise, the message unmistakable. Cruelty and envy directed at the innocent would be met with consequences that could not be evaded. Amara stood silently on the rise, watching the village below. The morning sun glinted on her hair, illuminating her serene expression. She did not gloat, she did not celebrate. The fire had enacted its will, and her role was that of witness and guardian. The villagers began to speak in hushed tones, acknowledging the power that had protected her and punished the guilty. The story of the final burn would be whispered for generations, a tale of the flame's sentient justice and the girl who had survived both fire and cruelty, becoming a living testament to the power of moral resilience and the unseen forces that protect those who act with goodness and courage.